This is a recording of a talk that I gave as part of the St Michael's Lichfield eco-fortnight in November 2022. It's entitled "Driven to Destruction, Is Climate and Environmentally Friendly Transport Possible?" And I'm going to be talking about just that, about the climate effects and the environmental effects of our modern transport systems. As such, the talk might be construed as being a little negative, but I want to start off by being a little more positive. Without a doubt, modern transport systems have led to major benefits for both individuals and societies in terms of growth of trade and of commerce, in terms of increased access to education and employment, in terms of accessibility for disadvantaged groups, particularly the disabled and the elderly, and more generally, opportunities for broadening people's experience of each other, of other places. There is much good that's come out of our modern transport systems, but most of our modern transport modes rely on carbon-based fuel, and that leads to carbon dioxide emissions in the exhaust, and carbon dioxide is, of course, a greenhouse gas, and that leads to global warming and climate change. Climate change is a given. It's happening. Here we see a graph of the temperature variation around the average temperature of the mid-20th century. And you can see there's a steady increase in temperature. This graph goes up to about 2012, 2013, and that increase in temperature has continued since then. But why should that be a concern to us? On the left, we have a picture of a representation of the heat anomalies during summer 2023, when large parts of Europe experienced extremely high temperatures, and indeed so did Britain. And those high temperatures will become more common as climate change kicks in. On the right, it shows those areas of Britain that are at risk of not just increased flooding, but almost continual inundation by the end of the century because of sea level rise caused by global warming. And of course, global warming causes natural disasters of different sorts to become more frequent. The atmospheric system becomes more unstable. We might get more wildfires, more droughts, more high cyclones. So climate change is important and is going to affect how we live. But before I go on to think about the effects of transport systems on climate on carbon production, I'll just start off by giving a bit of background to myself. I'm basically an academic civil engineer working in transport, working on the boundaries with environmental science and meteorology. My main expertise is in train aerodynamics, as you can see a book on the right there. And I have over the years worked for and with Great Britain Railways throughout my career, particularly looking at the effects of weather extremes, high wind, high temperatures, high rainfall, and so on. I've also worked with agronomists looking at the effects of high winds on rain and crops, and the effects of tornadoes and thunderstorm winds on buildings. And all these subjects, obviously, for all of them, climate change is a significant factor. So climate change is obviously of academic and professional interest to me. But there's more than that, of course. I, along with many others, are concerned about the effects of climate change on future generations. I'm a long-term public transport user, so that, again, is part of my background. And I'm also a clergyman, so I have a level of theological motivation too. Which probably isn't shared by many of you who are listening to this lecture. But from my perspective, I understand from Scripture that God has created the world and all that is in it, and humanity as stewards of that creation. And that word can be unpacked, but whatever stewardship means, it doesn't mean trashing the world in the way that we seem to be doing it at the moment. Climate change, of course, impacts the poorest most, and there's a consistent theme in both the Old and the New Testaments that God has particular concern for the poor. Being concerned for climate change is, to my mind, an outworking of neighbour love, which is, of course, the principle that Jesus explained in his great commandment, you shall love one another as I have loved you. And then there's a deeper motivation. The whole Jesus story in the New Testament of his birth, death and resurrection, incarnation and atonement, as we call it, is set in the New Testament not just in terms of the relationship between individuals and God being restored, but also in terms of God restoring the creation to the state that it should be in. There's a theological thread running through the New Testament of leading from creation to new creation. So there's some of my motivations, and I say we'll all have different ones, and in fact many different sets of motivations all ultimately end up in the same sorts of requirements for taking action. So in this talk I'll give an outline of transport emissions, I'll talk about trends and targets, I'll talk about other transport environmental issues, how we can move towards a low carbon transport system, and then ultimately, what can we do about it? What can the church do about climate change, about the use of transport in an era of climate change? So first of all, an outline of transport emissions. If we look at international CO2 emissions, and the graphs that follow show data along the bottom from 1750 to now, and you can see that the international CO2 emissions are about 35 million tonnes of carbon dioxide a year. Bear that figure in mind as it gives a context. If we break that down by industrial sector, we can see all the sectors are largely increasing, and their transport currently contributes about 8 billion tonnes of carbon dioxide, so somewhere over a quarter of the total international. In international terms, international shipping CO2 emissions about 0.75 billion, and international aviation emissions about 1 billion, and that is of course rising very, very steeply indeed there. Coming on to the situation in Britain, our overall CO2 emissions are decreasing. And so we're now down at about 400 million tonnes of CO2 equivalent, 0.4 billion. So somewhere around 1% or so of overall international emissions, rather more perhaps. In terms of sectors in the UK economy, most of the sectors are actually falling quite significantly, except the one that I've highlighted there of transport. Transport isn't decreasing, and it's currently about 0.13 billion, about something over a third of the total UK emissions, and that's not going down. That's what makes it so serious. If we look at emissions by different modes of transport, we can get a feel for what are the very poor emissions of domestic flights and of petrol and diesel driven cars, and the very good performance of national rail, electric vehicles, international rail, and also we should add cycling and walking, which is off the bottom of that scale, of course. So we're able to talk about the good, electric cars, international and national rail travel, cycling. We're able to identify the bad, international flights, petrol-driven, diesel-driven cars and lorries that contribute so much of our transport in this country. And of course, we can identify the ugly here being perhaps unfairly pictured as using a picture of Ryanair, and that is domestic flights are the very poor emitters. If we look at this in a different way, of emissions by different modes, showing on the bottom axis the time from 1990 to 2008, we can see that the bottom blue is cars and taxis, The red brown just above it is light vans, and the green above that are heavy goods vehicles. And between them, they make up most of our emissions in this country. So that's a quick outline of the emissions from various transport modes. Think briefly then about trends and targets. We've got in this country various targets for when we will achieve net zero greenhouse gas emissions, 2050 in England and Wales, pretty much. Scotland going for something a little earlier. And we can plot that target there. It doesn't take a lot of imagination to plot a graph like that. A straight line going down from the current situation. However, if we put on our current levels of transport emissions, and if they do indeed stay constant, as they seem to be doing, then we're not going to get there. We're going to bottom out at about 130 million tonnes of carbon dioxide a year. Various industries have set their own targets. These are usually couched in rather qualitative rather than quantitative terms. Here's one for the NHS. And interestingly, the arrow on the right there shows travel and then identifies it as out of scope. So it's something they don't consider. UK travel industry, the DfT, have got their own emissions, have got their own plan for net zero. Following on from the recent financial crisis and the recent budget, I think this is largely a fictional plan as it stands at the moment. In terms of societal trends, there are, of course, continuing trends for new car-dependent housing estates that are built without due regard to public transport, really building in the need for private cars. And there's one there on the left being built in Lichfield. And we still get continuing shopping malls and hospitals out of town that again drive motor car use. The one on the right there is what a school friend of mine refers to as Merry Hill in Brierley Hill, in fact. Road building continues, and there's some concern amongst transport engineers about the algorithms that the Department for Transport use to decide on road building, to decide on the carbon emissions from the building of new roads, and whether they match the sustainability targets or not. And I suspect there might be a lot of political activity in this area in the future. But I've talked about carbon emissions and current trends and so on, but there are other transport environmental issues that are very much tied up with it, to the extent that if we go about reducing transport emissions, carbon emissions, reducing the effects of carbon emissions on climate change, we also have some effect on other environmental issues. And there are many of these, and I name what I think are possibly the most common. It's not just about carbon emissions. Nitrogen dioxide and particulate emissions from exhaust is unknown to cause respiratory health effects. And these, of course, primarily affect people in high-density traffic areas such as London, shown on the right there. And these are, of course, the poorer members of our society. So we get NO2 from vehicle exhaust, particulates from the exhaust, but also from brake and road wear. And that's quite important for the future. By decarbonising our fuels, we don't necessarily stop all particulates. Government figures indicate that in the UK, somewhere between 28,000 and 36,000 deaths per year are due to air pollution, which is really a quite staggering figure, COVID-style proportions. It's not just cars, however. I was involved in 2016 in making some measurements in Birmingham New Street Station of the nitrogen dioxide levels there. And I don't intend to talk about it, but that picture at the top shows the NO2 emissions over the course of one day in December 2016. And all I'll say is that red line represents the public health limit. So you can see it's not good. It's a lot better than that now. But the real sinner in the story are the sorts of trains shown at the bottom there: Class 220, 221 Voyager trains, diesel trains. It's known, and again a provable fact, that the easy access to cars and the use of cars for short journeys tends to increase obesity. And there are 30,000 deaths due to obesity in the UK each year. They can't all be put down to our current transport systems, of course, but it's certainly a factor. And more recently, there's a suggestion from a new study that particulate matter in the atmosphere due to traffic has a significant effect upon dementia, and those in polluted areas, again, are more at risk in this regard. It's perhaps not wholly appreciated that there's a significant proportion of households that don't own a car, 22%. And those are the poorest people. They rely on public transport, and we'll see that public transport isn't what it should be. So our current transport systems, actually, for the poorest in them, have a tendency towards social exclusion and poverty that we shouldn't neglect. There's also the issue of land use. The picture at the top is rather disingenuous, as it's actually a picture of somewhere in the USA, where, of course, they have bigger and better car parks than anywhere else in the world. But in this country, we've got 8% of our land is developed in one way or another. Of that, almost half is due to highways and road transport, which is quite a staggering number, I think. And parking, my own figures here, not official ones, somewhere between 1 and 1.5% of that 3.7%. A large proportion of land in this country is set aside just to providing space for people to park on. Other transport, a much lower figure, about 0.4%. There are safety issues, of course. The number of deaths due to road vehicles has been falling over the past couple of decades, but it seems to have stabilized at somewhere around 1,800 deaths per year. It dipped in 2020, and that is actually due to less travel due to COVID. Okay, so that's sort of where we are. How can we move towards a low carbon transport system? Well, there are lots of potential ways. The priority for climate change mitigation, and indeed for environmental improvement, is to reduce carbon-based transport emissions. And obviously, we have control over how we do it in this country from road vehicles, but we also need to think about the international situation, shipping and international air traffic, that internationally is a big contributor to. One might say, of course, we don't need to travel so much. Their technical fix would be virtual travel through Zoom or Teams or something like that. However, if we look at how travel by different modes has changed post-COVID, and we can see on the left the big dip at the start of the COVID pandemic, then road recovered to about 100% of its pre-COVID values, road and rail to rail and tube to about 85%. It seems that people still want to travel. Now, the nature of that travel is somewhat different, in that there is more home working now than there was, and much of the travel, particularly by rail, in fact, has transferred to become a leisure market. But nonetheless, people want to travel. Virtual meetings have their place, but they're not a panacea in terms of climate change. Then there are electric vehicles, electric cars. We see lots of these cropping up now. A rather interesting experiment in Sweden at the bottom, showing lorries with pantographs running underneath electrical overhead cables. It's very difficult to get electrically driven large lorries because you can't get enough power to move the weight and to accelerate it. But using pantographs like that, it's possible. Similarly, in electrical terms, you can go for electric bikes, electric scooters, and they're becoming quite common in certain cities around England at the moment. But you have to ask, where is all that power coming from? If electric vehicles are going to be carbon friendly, then the power has to come from renewable sources. And at the moment, renewables contribute maybe a third, maybe a little more, of our total energy supply. If that is to increase to meet all our energy supply, if that is possible, then that's going to take a major effort over the next few years. And if you add into that the need for it to go even further to supply our transport system, then that's a big deal. And I'm not quite sure that that is achievable. Also, of course, electric batteries require lithium. And you can see on the left the growth of demand for lithium over the years. The mining of lithium is not an environmentally friendly process. You can see a lithium mine there in China. It's a carbon intensive, in fact, production system. And of course, electric cars still produce particulates into the atmosphere from road wear and from brake wear. So, okay, it's not bad, but it's still not absolutely an ideal way of decarbonising transport. You might say, can we use hydrogen vehicles using fuel cells whose only exhaust is water? Well, there are no emissions, but most carbon is produced from methane with a carbon dioxide release in the process. It could be produced from the electrolysis of water using renewable power, but that's a more expensive process. So at the moment, the production of hydrogen isn't, again, terribly environmentally friendly. The aircraft industry make very far-reaching claims about the prospects for using for carbon-free emissions from their flights. I think one has to be a little circumspect in believing them. I believe Iceland Air is one of the furthest advanced in terms of moving towards carbon-free, and they can see by 2030 they'll be able to use green propulsion using hydrogen fuel cells for 30-minute journeys only for 20 or 30-seater planes. That's about the limits. I think there's a long way to go before we get green aircraft in that regard. One interesting way of combating the land use of motor traffic on car parks and the like has been recently proposed by the French, where they're proposing that for all large car parks over 80 vehicles or so, then they should be covered by solar panels, which I think is a very nice idea. Moving on from technical fixes to infrastructure changes, one way of reducing car traffic is through either congestion charging or low traffic networks. Low traffic networks are simply you restrict traffic, reduce the speed of traffic. They're almost universally opposed when they're applied, when they're proposed, and they can become a political hot potato. Once they're in place, they tend to be very well regarded and nobody ever wants to get rid of them. Again, encouragingly, a very recent proposal is for a much fuller pedestrianisation of Lichfield town centre, obviously the town in which I live. We can change our infrastructure such that public transports encourage modal shift. And there we see a picture of the Midland Metro, I believe, with a not terribly carbon-friendly diesel train in the foreground and an electric tram in the background. Easy interchange there between them. But it's not so easy to get a great deal of modal shift. Those who've travelled on trains in this country will know that they can get crowded very quickly, even in this post-COVID era when commuter travel has fallen off significantly. And it's not just on trains. Fundamentally, the Great Britain railway system is full. It's when you take both freight and passenger into account, it's very, very difficult indeed to actually think about how you might get more trains onto the network. fundamentally the laws of physics in terms of braking and distances between trains actually mitigate against it. So if you're going to get modal shift, that requires a significant new build of railways. And that's what Northern Powerhouse Rail and HS2 are about. It's about providing extra capacity to allow more traffic overall to be carried on the railways, and that's perhaps not fully appreciated by many. Of course, you can have infrastructure change to encourage active travel, cycleways and walkways, cargo bikes. The histogram on the right shows the journey distance against the proportion of journeys of that distance. And most of the journeys in this country are between 2 and 4 miles, quite walkable, quite cyclable. And the cycling and walking, I think, will play a great part in transport in the future. It also gives the opportunity for a little light relief in terms of this presentation, where we can look at some pictures of cycleways as designed by local authority engineers who've never been on a bike. I'm a little at a loss to know how one should deal with that. Similarly, that doesn't seem the most useful of cycleways. It gives you protection from pedestrians about 5 yards. If you feel like a little danger in your life, you might care to try that one. I think that is almost a metaphor for cycleways, of how they're designed, something to stop you. And again, if you want to take your life into your hands to use a cycleway, all you have to do is cycle across a couple of lanes of traffic. But I think the best one is that one there. I don't think the people who designed the cycleway actually were responsible for the arrow on the tree. I think that is something of a comment made by somebody. We can also encourage behavioural change in terms of car sharing, in terms of car clubs, where you just use a car when you need it and you don't own a car yourself. Active travel, cycling and walking, and encouraging behavioural change towards modal shift. So lots of ways then of how we might reduce the carbon impact of transport, reduce the overall environmental impact of transport. So what can we do about it? Well, what can we do? There are lots of things. We could try carrying out a personal and household travel audit to give ourselves a basis for where we are in terms of our own carbon emissions. We can think about walking and cycling, using electric vehicles, although they're not a complete solution, of course. We can use public transport more, think about vehicle sharing and car clubs. I'd strongly urge avoiding all domestic flights and travel by train or land transport if possible. Even for short-haul European flights, it's quite possible to take rail to many destinations in the near continent. And I think we all need to think very carefully before making any long-haul flights at all and ration ourselves on that. And in international terms, in terms of reducing the need for international aviation, international shipping, perhaps reduce purchases by the Amazons of this world that require long-distance shipping. So there are all ways that we can do something ourselves, but that's not easy. In the UK, we have a very poor public transport system. The rail network is in some disarray because of industrial issues and because, frankly, of incompetence in the Department for Transport that effectively controls it. Bus routes are being axed across England all the time. Cycling can be dangerous and the infrastructure is poor. So I don't think we should beat ourselves up about not being able to reduce our carbon footprint in this way. We need to think seriously, but I don't think we should feel guilty every time we get into a car, because in this country, often there's no other way. But I would suggest that one way about this is to think about advocacy, think about trying to influence our policymakers, our councillors, our members of parliament, who, if they hear often enough from people, do tend to take action, particularly our electorate. We can advocate for improved public transport by bus or rail. for better public cycling infrastructure and better electrical charging infrastructure. We can oppose building on brownfield sites, building on greenfield sites, and encourage building on brownfield sites with good public and active travel facilities. We can advocate for the relocation of out-of-town facilities, and we can oppose new road schemes. I find those difficult to justify at the moment. And most of all, by our example, by whatever we say, we can challenge the quite extraordinary car-dependent culture that we have in this country. Obviously, I'm a clergyman, so what can the church do about it? What I'm about to say applies to some degree or other for other large organisations as well. We can acknowledge the issue. The Church of England has a route map to net zero carbon by 2030. It's a route map without too many numbers, but at least it does acknowledge transport in there, even if only in rather broad qualitative ways. You shall move to sustainable transport. That sort of word occurs many times during that report. At my particular church at St Michael's in Lichfield, where this talk was first given, we carried out a carbon dioxide audit in 2008 of activities in 2018. This was done late 2019, and we haven't really taken it much further, largely due to the pandemic. But we found at the time our gas consumption contributed 10 tonnes of carbon dioxide, electricity about 10 tonnes again, travel to church, trips generated by being a church, 7.5 tonnes, and other trips by 6 tonnes. That last figure is probably inflated because that year we sent the junior choir to Venice, and they of course flew on short-haul flights. A total of 33 tonnes, of which about 40% was transport, and that perhaps gives pause for thought. In the wider sense, in terms of church organisation, I think the church can take account of transport carbon emissions in all aspects of church life. In Lichfield Diocese, along with many other dioceses in the country, we're thinking about pastoral reorganisation as the number of clergy falls. That, to some degree, implies a centralisation of facilities. And if we're not careful, that can lead to an increase in the need for road transport. We perhaps need to think about meeting venues. Again, in my diocese of Lichfield, it's actually very difficult for people from most parts of the diocese to actually get to Lichfield unless they come down through Birmingham. It's not the ideal place for a meeting. Perhaps we can think more radically of service times and venues when we could get to church by public transport if you have to travel a distance. I tell you that service time isn't, public transport isn't happening at 10 o'clock on Sunday mornings when most services happen. But there's another aspect to the issue in church terms. St. Paul writes in his letter to the Ephesians, "For our struggle is not against enemies of blood and flesh, but against the rulers, against the authorities, against the cosmic powers of this present darkness, against the spiritual forces of evil in the heavenly places." One way of interpreting this rather severe verse is that the rulers, the authorities, the cosmic powers of the present age, the spiritual forces of evil, can be interpreted as those human-based systems that we've put into place and provide and produce much good, but can also produce much that is evil and wrong. And here I think in particular about the global finance system, about the forces of nationalism, and perhaps also about our current transport system. And the call, I think, here is to pray against this binding by these spiritual forces. And perhaps one of the things that churches should do is to pray that we as a society might overcome this car dependence that we have, might cease to be less bound by the our car-dependent culture. I suspect others will not agree or will find that sort of argument quite a difficult one if you don't have the same worldview as I do. So coming on to a conclusion then, is climate-friendly transport possible? Is environmentally friendly transport possible? And the overall answer is it's complicated. Lots of things we can do, but lots of compromises that we have to make. Is climate-friendly transport possible? Yes, but we need significantly increased renewable generating capacity if we're going to get anywhere near it. Is environmentally friendly transport possible? And here the answer is more ambiguous, it's more difficult, and it requires significant changes in society and individuals to move away from the culture of car dependency. So, the answers to my questions. Thank you for listening and watching, and I hope you found this of interest.